eggs are an incredibly rich source of nutrients for the brain. And that's because the egg actually, if you think about it, contains all the nutrients that are required in order for an organism to grow, a bird that's in it. So what are the things that directly impact brain health, and what are the foods that we can eat that will support brain health? Before we can even consider the fuels that neurons use in order to function, we have to talk about the elements that actually allow those neurons to be there and to stay healthy, what actually makes up those neurons. And that brings us to what I would argue is the most important food element for brain function, and that is fat. And that might come as a surprise, but unless one considers the water content of the brain, which is very high, a lot of our brain and a lot of the integrity of the nerve cells, the so-called neurons in our brain, and the other types of cells comes from fat. And that's because nerve cells and other cells in the brain have a external layer. It's what's sometimes called a double-layered membrane. It's essentially two thin layers that serve as a boundary between those cells, and that boundary is very important because how things pass across that boundary actually regulates the electrical activity of neurons, which is the way that neurons fire and communicate and keep you thinking and acting and doing all the good things that those neurons allow us to do. And those membranes are made up of fats, but they're not made up of the fats that are around our belly, around the other organs of our body. They're not made up of storage fat. They are made up of structural fat. And maintaining the so-called integrity of that structural fat, meaning the health of those neurons, is going to come in large part from the foods that we eat. Now, this needs to be underscored. What I'm saying is that the foods that we eat actually provide the structural basis, the building blocks of the very neurons that allow us to think over time. And as I mentioned earlier, the fat that makes up those neurons and other nerve cells is different than the other types of fat in the body. So what type of fat is it, and what should we eat in order to support that fat and those neurons? And the answer is the so-called essential fatty acids and phospholipids. Now, those are more or less the same thing, but I just want to make a very large literature very crystal clear. Essential fatty acids can include the so-called EPA variety or DHA variety. You hear about omega-3s and omega-6s. Most people are getting enough omega-6s from their diet. Not everybody, but most people are getting enough omega-6s. However, most people are not getting enough omega-3s in their diet to support healthy brain function in the short and long term. I've talked before about the benefits of elevating the levels of omega-3s in one's diet for sake of offsetting depression and for enhancing mood. And indeed, there's a wealth of literature now pointing to the fact that ingesting at least 1 or 2 or even 3 grams per day of EPA form of essential fatty acid can have positive effects on mood and well-being that are at least on par with some of the major antidepressant treatments out there, but without similar side effects to those antidepressant treatments. And that for people that are already taking antidepressants, that supplementing with 1 to 2 to 3 grams of EPA essential fatty acids can actually allow a lower dose of antidepressant treatment to be used and still be effective. So that's depression, but just in terms of maintaining normal cognitive function in people that aren't depressed, the EPAs and omega-3s seem to play a very important role. Of course, you can supplement EPAs through various fish oils, and it could be liquid fish oil or capsule fish oil. Some people, if they're not interested in eating fish for whatever reason, they're allergic or for ethical reasons, they can take krill oil. And if they don't want to use krill oil, they can use algae and other forms of EPA. However, I think it's clear that one can get a lot of EPA from the proper foods. And it turns out that those foods, not surprisingly, don't just contain high levels of EPA, but they also contain other things that are beneficial for brain health. So what are foods that are high in omega-3s that we should all probably be consuming at least on a daily basis? The number one is fish. So things like mackerel and salmon and herring and oysters and sardines and anchovies. And perhaps the heavyweight champion of EPAs per unit volume is caviar. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not eating a lot of fish. I'm not eating a lot of caviar. I can't remember the last time I had a caviar unless it was sprinkled on a little bit of sushi. I'm not a big fish eater personally. I will from time to time, but that's one reason why one might want to supplement with EPAs from another source. But Also, EPAs are found in chia seeds, in walnuts, in soybeans, and other plant-based foods. You can look these up online, and you'll immediately see that there are a lot of sources of EPAs. And many of the foods that I listed off might be appetizing to you. Some of them might be unappetizing to you, or some of them you might be sort of neutral about. But it's very clear that eating foods that are rich in omega-3s and or supplementing with omega-3s to get above that 1.5 grams and ideally up to 2 or even 3 grams per day of EPA can be very beneficial for cognitive function in the short and long term. Again, I want to emphasize that you don't have to consume fish and animal products in order to get sufficient EPAs. You can get them from plants, but I do believe, based on the quality peer-reviewed research, that everybody should be striving to get a minimum threshold of at least 1.5 grams of EPAs per day, one way or the other. The great thing about omega-3s is that they are also thought to be beneficial for things like cardiovascular health. And although there's some controversy there as to whether or not 2 grams or 3 grams or 6 grams is ideal for cardiovascular health, I think the bulk of evidence points to the fact that getting sufficient omega-3s in the diet is going to support cardiovascular health. Certainly not the only thing people should be doing to support their cardiovascular health, aerobic exercise and so forth being important also, but it does seem to support cardiovascular health, and in doing so, supporting brain health. However, what I'm emphasizing is ingestion of omega-3s to support the very cells within the brain that make up our cognition, that allow for cognition and for movement and memory and all the other marvelous things that the brain does. The other compound that has been shown to be directly supportive of neuronal function is phosphatydilserine, which is abundant in meats and in fish. So here we are again, back to fish being an important source of brain-supporting food. Phosphatydilserine is something that nowadays people are supplementing. It's a lipid-like compound that, at least in 3 studies, have been shown to improve cognition. These weren't huge effects, but they were statistically significant effects. And as well in more than 3, at least 5 studies to reduce cognitive decline. And this is interesting. In every case, it was 300 milligrams supplemented phosphatidylserine, but one, again, doesn't need to supplement phosphatidylserine. Phosphatidylserine can be derived, as I mentioned, from meats and fish, and to some extent from cabbage, of all things. I don't know how much cabbage people are ingesting, but later when we talk about gut health and the relationship between gut health and brain health, I'll mention fermented foods, and of course, one of the most readily available fermented foods out there that at least many people find appetizing is sauerkraut, which is, of course, made from cabbage. It's fermented cabbage. So for those of you that do consume meat and fish, provided you're getting enough fish, you're probably getting enough phosphatidylserine. For those of you that are interested in supplementing phosphatidylserine to get these effects that were reported in these various manuscripts, which, by the way, I've read and look solid. I mean, I don't think we've seen the landmark study showing that supplementing with phosphatidylserine at 300 milligrams per day is going to create a huge offsetting of a massive cognitive decline or a massive increase in brain function. These seem to be modest effects, but the effects do appear to be real. And for those of you that are interested in supplementing with phosphatidylserine, it's a relatively inexpensive supplement that, again, is lipid-like. So it's mimicking some of the same things that you would get from food, but in higher concentration. Now, after EPA, fatty acids, and phosphatidylserine, I would say third on the list of things that come from food that can readily support brain function would be choline. And that's because of the relationship to choline in the biosynthesis pathway for acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neuromodulator, not a neurotransmitter, but a neuromodulator in the brain. A neuromodulator is a chemical that modulates the function of many brain circuits and also circuits within the body. I'll mention what those are in a moment, but acetylcholine as a neuromodulator tends to enhance the activity, the electrical activity and chemical activity of certain sets of neurons and downplay the activity of other neurons. So it's sort of a conductor of sorts, leading to enhanced function and activity in certain brain areas and circuits and not in others. For instance, the brain areas that are involved in focus and alertness. We have multiple clusters of neurons in our brain that make acetylcholine. Two of the most prominent and well-known are the so-called nucleus basalis, which is a cluster of neurons deep in the basal forebrain that highlight particular areas of our brain. Highlight meaning when acetylcholine is released from those neurons at their nerve endings in particular areas of the brain, those particular areas of the brain can undergo enhanced levels of activity relative to surrounding areas. So it's kind of a electrical highlighter pen, if you will, by analogy. That is the basis of much of what we call focus, or our ability to concentrate on a particular batch of information that's coming in through our eyes, our ears, our nose, or even things that we're just thinking in our head. So having ample choline for production of acetylcholine allows for focus through, of course, many intervening steps. There are also regions of the brain in the so-called back of the brain, the hindbrain, that release acetylcholine that are involved in general states of alertness. And not surprisingly then, many of the treatments for Alzheimer's disease, which is an inability or challenges with remembering things and focusing, are drugs that impact the acetylcholine pathway and are aimed at enhancing the amount of acetylcholine that's available to neurons. And it can do that through a number of different mechanisms. You can do that by enhancing the amount of acetylcholine that's created, or you can do that by taking a drug that can reduce the amount of enzyme that gobbles up the acetylcholine, and in doing so, leading to more net acetylcholine. But outside of the scenario where somebody has cognitive decline due to Alzheimer's, all of us are able to focus to some degree or not, or are able to be alert to some degree or not, based on the amount of acetylcholine that we have. Now, other processes, of course, are involved, but what this means is that making sure that we have enough of the substrates to create acetylcholine is vital if we want to be able to focus. And that's why dietary choline is so vital. And the primary source for dietary choline would be eggs, and in particular, egg yolks. Eggs are an incredibly rich source of nutrients for the brain. And that's because the egg actually, if you think about it, contains all the nutrients that are required in order for an organism to grow. You know, a bird that's in a eggshell, it's got the yolk there, and it's using that yolk for a reason. It's using that yolk as a source of fuel. It's using that yolk as a source of literally building blocks in order to create its nervous system. Many years ago, I worked on chick embryos, and there's these amazing experiments. You could actually take an egg and you could create a little window in the top, and these were fertilized eggs, and you'd see over time, you could peer in there, literally look in with a microscope or even with the naked eye, and you would see this little chick embryo sitting on top of that yolk, growing and growing and growing and growing, and the yolk getting smaller and smaller. It's really incredible. They're using that as a source for all the building blocks of the body, but in particular, the nervous system. So eggs are a rich source of choline. Some people will supplement with choline. However, food sources seem to be the best source of choline. And as with the EPAs and the omega-3s, there are plenty of foods that are non-animal based that contain choline. So if you're somebody who doesn't eat eggs or doesn't want to eat eggs, things like potatoes, nuts, and seeds, and grains and fruit, they don't have as much choline as eggs, but they do contain choline. So you can look up the values of choline that are present in those various foods and make sure that you're reaching the threshold amount of choline for you. In general, most people should probably strive to get somewhere between 500 milligrams and a gram of choline per day, so 1,000 milligrams. And some people rely on supplementation in order to hit those levels because they're not eating a lot of egg yolks or they're not eating a lot of other foods. Certain fish contain choline, for instance, and the other foods I listed off a few minutes ago from plant-based sources. So some people will supplement with 50 to 100 milligrams or whatever amount is necessary to get them up to that 1 gram or even a 2 gram dose per day. So we have 3 things that we know can support nerve cells. EPA, in particular omega-3 fatty acids, phosphatydilserine, and choline. Those 3 things I would list off as the top 3 things for enhancing neuron function and the integrity of neurons in the short and long term.